February 26, 1918, thousands of people from China and the world over gathered at Happy Valley Racecourse for the annual Derby Day in Hong Kong Island in British Hong Kong. While the masses were enjoying the races and placing wagers on their favorite thoroughbreds, the temporary grandstands built from wood, bamboo, and matting collapsed. In an instant, hundreds of guests were trapped and many crushed under the weight of the structures. The dire situation escalated even further as the fallen grandstands caught fire, which rapidly spread through the wreckage, leading to one of the worst fires in China's long, storied history. Derby Day, which marked the start of the horse racing season, was a tradition in Hong Kong since 1864. Built on swampland on Hong Kong Island, Happy Valley Racecourse, which was Hong Kong's first racecourse, initially opened in 1845 and held its first race in 1846. Horse racing had been primarily a Western attraction, but the sport was brought to Hong Kong by Britain following their victory in the First Opium War, which they fought against China between the years of 1839 and 1842. This 3-year military conflict was caused by discontent that resulted from the Qing dynasty's ban on opium. While opium had already been banned for nearly 20 years by the start of the war, it was only becoming more problematic in China as British merchants continued to illegally smuggle it into the country in increasing amounts. In 1839, Emperor Daoguang organized a military defense on the coast to stop the opium trade by force. In the month of March, nearly 1,200 tons of opium was seized from British dealers. For the British merchants, the opium trade was tremendously lucrative, so the ban and the enormous quantity of drugs confiscated from them represented a substantial financial loss. The British took the side that the British merchants should be compensated for their lost product, while the Chinese threatened the death penalty for further infractions. This point of contention degraded relations between the nations into the First Opium War. Ultimately, the British defeated the Qing dynasty, and one of the outcomes was the signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which forced the Chinese government to cede control of Hong Kong, formally making it a British colony called British Hong Kong. The occupancy of Hong Kong by Britain brought Western influence to the Chinese city. Despite the ugly conflicts that led to the Western influence in Hong Kong, Derby Day was a celebrated event, which people anticipated each year with great excitement. As a standard practice of preparing for Derby Day, temporary structures called mat sheds were constructed from wood, bamboo, and palm leaves. These structures were generally 2 or 3 stories, or about 50 feet tall, each with an occupancy of around 300 people. The mat sheds were built hastily, generally within 3 weeks of the start of the races. The structures offered viewing areas on the ground levels and top levels. The height of the structures, which were designed to resemble Roman amphitheaters, provided great perspective for those within. Moreover, these structures typically featured food vendors in the bottom floors and offered items such as alcoholic beverages, food items, and hot tea, usually heated and kept warm over a charcoal fire. Of course, one of the main draws to these grandstands was gambling. Each stand offered its patrons the ability to place wagers on their preferred horses in a variety of different betting structures. The amenities offered to customers were important, as paying for the construction and the license to build the mat sheds was quite expensive. So those operating the stands had to ensure they were profitable to avoid losing the owner a sizable investment. Even though there was a formal process in place for the construction of mat sheds, oversight was minimal. The mat sheds were not anchored into the ground. Instead, they were built side by side and lashed to nearby trees or other existing mat sheds. It was the second day of racing for the Hong Kong Jockey Club's annual meeting when things took a terrible turn. Very abruptly, the westernmost mat shed leaned toward Wong Ni Chong Road, collapsed, and hit the ground with a reverberating slam. Suddenly, the joyous scene at the racetrack was replaced with panicked horror. Screaming patrons fled from the site of the collapse, and, in rapid succession, Each additional match shed fell, being pulled down by the others on which they were lashed. In the words of South China Morning Post the following day, people were seen rushing out of the stands onto the course, and then came a noise like the explosion of a huge string of crackers. The match shed nearest the golf club was seen to lead toward the road and collapse. The rest of the line of match sheds followed like a pack of cards, burying hundreds of their inmates in their ruins. As stated in that article, hundreds were pinned under the wood and bamboo of the match sheds. Stories recounting the details illustrate how quickly it unfolded. One of the vendors selling cash sweeps tickets recalled glancing over and seeing the building next to her falling. After she called out a warning, it was mere seconds before terrified occupants stampeded out of the building. With no time to react, the building crashed into hers and threw her into a corner, forcing her to cut her way out through the roof. What was already a dangerous situation became infinitely worse. One of the match sheds in the middle of the row quickly went up in flames, likely due to falling onto open charcoal flames used by the food vendors. The combination of extremely flammable building materials and dry weather conditions was devastating. The entire row of match sheds were completely engulfed within half an hour of the collapse. People rushed to help, but the fire spread so rapidly that they were halted in their tracks. It has been noted that the conflagration spread so quickly that rescuers did not have time to free the trapped from within. South China Morning Post stated, "There were many cases of people being burnt to death in front of the eyes of would-be rescuers, men working on with desperation until the flames were literally on top of them." Due to the dangerously fast speed at which the fire spread, the results were severe. 614 people died in this tragic disaster, an astonishing figure, considering the total number of visitors to the race, many of whom occupied outdoor space only. A staggering 20% of all attendees lost their lives that day. In the days that followed, there was much criticism for the response. It was alleged by some that the people in charge would not permit the builders to dig into the ground in order to adequately secure the foundations of the temporary buildings, and that this is what led to the necessity of lashing them to trees and other structures. Many were also critical of the police response, stating that the police stopped people from entering the blaze to save their relatives. Others accused the police of not acting with due diligence to save lives when the moments presented. An example was provided that, allegedly, there were children hanging from the end of a pole above a fire, and simply cutting a beam could have saved them, but the police refused. A formal inquiry was commissioned 6 days after the event, on March 4th. The inquiry determined that the Director of Public Works was partially at fault for failing to implement safety standards for the construction of the temporary grandstands. The police captain was also found to be partially responsible for failing to take necessary precautions for ensuring public safety. At the recommendation of the inquiry, temporary grandstands constructed of flammable materials were no longer used. By the next year, permanent grandstands were constructed of brick and concrete. Also constructed after the fire was the Racecourse Fire Memorial. The beautiful monument, completed in 1922, is dedicated in memory of all the lives lost in the tragic incident that took place in February of 1918, and while the surrounding scenery is vastly different, the Happy Valley Racecourse is still in use today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this short documentary, please like the video and subscribe to my channel to help it grow. Until next time.